We had 2 bags of grass, 75 pellets of mescaline, 5 sheets of high-powered blotter acid, a salt shaker half full of cocaine, a whole galaxy of multicolored uppers, downers, screamers, laughers, also a quarter tequila, quarter rum, case of beer, pint of raw ether, and 2 dozen amyls.
When director Terry Gilliam arrived at the Cannes Film Festival in May 1998, it was with a cocky attitude. He was still fueled by the fire that propelled his latest motion picture from a 27-year-old novel-length Rolling Stone article to an entry into the competition for that year's Palme d'Or. His film was a cinematic hallucination, spawned from the 60s acid hangover, post-Vietnam guilt, and the dangerous hedonism of an era that the film's target audience, me, had never experienced firsthand. As a teenager growing up in the suburbs outside of Atlanta, I didn't even know you could tell a story like this and get away with it. And once I did, it changed everything.
Yeah, I know, I'm guilty. I understand that. I knew it was a crime. I did it anyway. Why argue I'm a criminal? Look at me.
Hi, I'm your screen jockey, Justin Neal. Today, I'm going to talk about what was labeled the most widely released midnight movie ever made. Its creation was anachronistic at a time when drugs, dissent, and unrest were largely absent from the major studio entertainment of the late 90s. It was not from the time in which it was released. The goal was to try and be true to that book and get it up there honestly without any apologies, because we seem to live in a world where there is nothing but apologies. Well, his movie was going to be subversive and unapologetic about it. A lullaby about the end of a generation that lost its movement. The last nail in the coffin of the American dream. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was one of the most politically extreme movies to be released by a major studio in years. It's a surreal indictment of American greed and excess, and it stormed the south of France on the backs of crusaders.
I think it's a very intelligent film, but you've got to get on the right track before you get derailed on this thing. And you've got to be able to move fast from one direction to another, because it's not an easy ride.
By the end of the day, the whole endeavor had become a nightmare for the poor souls tasked with shepherding Hunter S. Thompson's Gonzo outcast to the big screen. Producer Layla Nabolsi later said,
"At the beginning of the night, you're walking up the red carpet. At the end of the night, you're flat on your face at the Carlton, and you're in ruins. The next day was full of hideous reviews. We got run out of town.
Too weird to live, and too rare to die."
A week later, it was released in US cinemas and bombed, arriving for rental in November 1998. I had just turned 17 when it appeared on the Blockbuster new release wall, and had never heard of it or Hunter S. Thompson when I took it home to watch that night on a pan and scan VHS tape. That night changed the trajectory of my life like it had been hit by an asteroid, and I needed to know everything I could about where it came from. This is the story of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
I'm a relatively respectable citizen. Multiple felon, perhaps, but certainly not dangerous.
So it's good to act crazy first, because later you can appear normal. Hunter S. Thompson was born in Kentucky and remained half a Southern gentleman for the rest of his life because of it. He was a complex, troubled but determined individualist who watched a movement and its wave finally break and roll back. A freelance writer through the early 60s, he found a career launch with a 1965 article about the legendary misfit biker club, the Hells Angels, published by Random House as a book in 1967.
That book is 60% cheap trash. This is what happened.
You finished.
And he said, "Hunter, you want some of this?" And you said no. But you got it anyway.
Though it cost him an actual stomping by some of the gang, the success of the Hells Angels book brought Hunter to the attention of a national audience. This rise in exposure culminated in the unexpected new journalism breakthrough, The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved. Hunter was sent to his home turf of Kentucky to cover the 1970 Kentucky Derby, where he partnered with a newly arrived British illustrator named Ralph Steadman, who afterwards became a lifelong friend and collaborator. The published article wasn't really about the Derby at all, but a running commentary of the drunken, shameless behavior and entitled jabbering of the overdressed spectators, accompanied by the surreal, disturbing illustrations created by Steadman. Hunter was up against a deadline he couldn't make, and out of sheer desperation started sending pages to the editor as they were written. He was not only reporting it, he was willfully a part of it.
First, I realized I was doing something different. A friend of mine, he wrote me a note saying, that Derby piece was pure Gonzo. And I thought, well, if that's what it was, I thought it was a brutal failure. I'd botched my assignment, I regard it as one of my worst failures. And I got this onslaught of mail. Mail called saying I made a great breakthrough in journalism.
With this new style, Hunter had created an attitude and a voice based on the William Faulkner idea that the best fiction is far more true than any kind of journalism. And the best journalists have always known this. Free enterprise, the American dream, Horatio Alger gone mad on drugs in Las Vegas. Do it now. Pure Gonzo journalism. So early the next year, Hunter found himself on assignment in Los Angeles for Rolling Stone and had been trying to get time with his main source for the piece, a civil rights lawyer named Oscar Acosta, who was deeply involved with the whole scene. But this was a dangerous, racially tense atmosphere given the circumstances, and they both thought it was best to get out of town for a chance to talk in peace. As cover, Hunter accepted an offer from Sports Illustrated to write some copy for the Mint 400 off-road race taking place in March of 1971 outside Las Vegas, Nevada. When it was over though, what had started as a 250-word photo caption assignment turned into a 2,500-word manuscript about doom and failure that Sports Illustrated rightfully rejected. Quick on his feet, Thompson pivoted and pitched it to Jan Winter,
Yeah, I'll talk to Hunter now.
founder of Rolling Stone,
I mean, do you think it's a potentially serious thing?
who liked the concept but knew it needed more.
Brain damage.
So Thompson and Acosta returned to Vegas a second time a month later to attend the National District Attorneys Association's conference on narcotics and dangerous drugs, which Thompson would use as a raw basis for part 2 of the Vegas story. He worked at it feverishly for the next 6 months, and in November of 1971, Rolling Stone published Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a savage journey into the heart of the American dream under the byline Raoul Duke, the fictional author of the story. With illustrations again by Ralph Steadman, Thompson later called it a failed experiment in Gonzo journalism.
I was going back to Vegas. I had no choice.
I found myself imposing a fictional framework on what began as a piece of straight crazy journalism. But regardless how he felt about his work, Fear and Loathing became a benchmark in American literature of the 20th century, especially for anyone invested in the counterculture. And it was ripe for adaptation to the big screen.
I have no idea whether you think you're taking or making a film about Duke or Thompson. I haven't thought about it until now. And I'm filling with hate and rage right now just thinking about it.
Cut to later in the 70s, and Universal wanted to adapt Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas into a feature film, but there were issues with the rights, and it had stalled early in the process, as these things often do. A couple years later, the idea was picked up by up-and-coming movie producer Art Linson, who wanted to make it his directorial debut.
Shut up! You get words when I want to give them to you!
Finding Fear and Loathing still in limbo, he hired screenwriter John Kay to adapt an article Hunter had written for Rolling Stone in 1977 called
No need to panic, huh?
The Banshee Screams for Buffalo Meat, his eulogy for the now missing Oscar Acosta. According to Kay, he spent a lot of time and did a lot of drugs with Hunter while researching the script all through 1978, ultimately basing the caricature rather more on the Doonesbury cartoon version of Thompson, known as Uncle Duke, who began appearing in 1974. Oscar Acosta was also whitewashed and turned into a Hungarian lawyer named Karl Laszlo.
As your attorney, I advise you to leave this room at once.
Right.
Directed by first-timer Art Linson after taking a 4-month crash course in filmmaking and shot by legendary cinematographer Tak Fujimoto, Where the Buffalo Roam was filmed in 1979 and starred Saturday Night Live comic Bill Murray, while Hunter became an executive producer and wandered around shooting firearms in between takes.
Hey, guns don't scare me, buddy! I'm a weapons expert!
He inhaled him like Hunter inhaled an 8-ball.
What?
Released in 1980 and more a series of vignettes than a hero's journey, it adheres to a slice of life template rather than a driving narrative, and it also bombed on its release. It played great in San Francisco, but everywhere else no one really understood why they would make a movie about a journalist in the first place.
No thanks.
Despite its box office failure, Where the Buffalo Roam established Hunter Thompson as a pop icon,
Jesus, it's happening already.
an action figure for the counterculture.
Fascist swine!
It's said that when Bill Murray returned to Saturday Night Live, he was still full of Gonzo attitude, and it took a while for that to wear off.
In my case, I hate to advocate drugs or liquor, violence, insanity to anyone. But in my case, it's worked.
And speaking of Saturday Night Live, cut back 7 years to 1973 and enter Layla Nabolsi, who was best friends in high school with the sister of writer-director Christopher Guest, who 10 years before Spinal Tap was in a rock and roll parody show called National Lampoon Lemmings, which ran for 350 shows off Broadway and included pre-SNL stars Chevy Chase and John Belushi. They all went on to start the National Lampoon Radio Hour the next year, along with Bill Murray, Gilda Radner, and Harold Ramis, many of whom went on to become Saturday Night Live. So Layla Nabulsi knew all of these people, became good friends with John Belushi and his wife Judy, and actually hung out with Bill Murray on his first day in New York City. Flash forward to the summer of 1976, and Rolling Stone had Belushi and Aykroyd make an East Coast to West Coast road trip for the magazine, stopping off in Colorado to meet Hunter at his fortified compound outside Woody Creek, just north of Aspen. Layla said that they had come back raving about a Southern writer, but in her mind she was thinking a Truman Capote type. So when she stumbled upon him lounging in Belushi's dressing room 3 years later, she was a little shocked to learn that this gangly, 6'5" charismatic freak was the journalist that had penned Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. By now with a sizable cult following and Hunter half a celebrity in literati circles. It was a twisted meet cute, and they began a torrid affair soon after, which stalled when she found out that he was still married to his first wife. When Hunter and Sandy divorced the next year, the romance with Layla rekindled, and they shacked up together for the next half a decade. But first...
Well, they've nailed me, god. I'm trapped in some stinking desert crossroads called Baker. I don't have much time, man. The are closing in. They'll hunt me down like a beast.
Oh, getting a little paranoid.
I need a fucking lawyer immediately!
In 1981, Layla and Hunter were hiding out down at a friend's place in Mobile, Alabama, when they were contacted by an expat living in the UK named Lou Stein. He'd adapted a stage play of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas in England, while heroically neglecting to get the rights until an associate advised him to do so. They scoped out this guy's reviews, gave him the okay, and out of sheer curiosity caught a flight over the Atlantic to see if he could pull it off. She said of the London-based show,
And what he did, which was really smart, he used the device of a narrator, so there were two hunters. There was one on stage doing the action, and the other was the narrator.
Technically, Hunter had control of the theatrical rights, but in 1976, he'd foolishly sold the movie rights in perpetuity, which means indefinitely, for a measly 10 grand to a man named John Juergens, who was heir to the Juergens hand cream fortune. But Hunter never actually signed the paper, which is unsurprising if you know anything about him. So now Layla tracks Juergens down and they renegotiate, with Layla talking Juergens into becoming an early investor to the tune of 250 grand. But this all took time, and after living with Hunter for 5 years, Layla unsurprisingly needed a change, and they broke up. In the aftermath though, Layla got the rights to produce the movie.
People always ask, how did you get the rights to Fear and Loathing? I always joked, it was cheaper than palimony.
Are these your drugs?
Look, Dad, it's
Where
not...
did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
After taking some time away, she had the playwright Lou Stein write a screenplay based on his own theatrical adaptation. But this was the Reagan 80s, just say no era. And as they took meetings and passed the script around, even if the reader thought it was funny, everyone in Hollywood passed. She said,
It wasn't until Gus Van Sant made Drugstore Cowboy that the idea of Fear and Loathing became more acceptable.
She pursued the rookie and offered him the project, but he chose to do My Own Private Idaho with River Phoenix, who died of an overdose in 1993 outside the Viper Room in Los Angeles, which was partly owned by his friend Johnny Depp. So after Gus Van Sant dropped out, Layla spent a year developing a script with Jake Scott, son of legendary British filmmaker Ridley Scott. It was during this time that Benicio del Toro began orbiting the project, but he was usual suspects sized, and Layla was unsure about the needed weight gain. Benicio later said, "What can I say? If you eat 16 donuts a day, you will gain 2 to 3 pounds a day." Unfortunately, this too went unrealized when Ridley's production company lost their financing. The whole deal fell apart and Nabulsi was back to owning the rights.
Excuse me, sir.
What?
You can't park. Hey, you can't park your car here.
Why not? Is this not a reasonable place to park?
Reasonable, you're on a sidewalk. It's the sidewalk.
Then she was approached by a small production company based out of LA called Rhino Films, whose head of production, Steve Nemeth, really wanted to finally produce a film version of Fear and Loathing. She was hesitant, but running out of options.
It was kind of a bad idea because Rhino didn't have enough experience to know what they were doing. They just ran amok for a while.
And by a while, she meant several years. There had been many attempts to get Fear and Loathing made into a feature film since it was first published. Jack Nicholson and Marlon Brando had originally been considered as Raoul Duke and Dr. Gonzo in the early mid-70s, followed in the late 70s by John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. Martin Scorsese was attached until Belushi's untimely death put an end to that incarnation. Names such as John Malkovich and John Cusack came and went over the years, but it was Hunter that thought of Johnny Depp. They first met through a mutual friend during the Christmas of '94 at Thompson's frequent haunt, the Woody Creek Tavern, afterwards retreating to Owl Farm, where Hunter made an explosive using nitroglycerin in a gas tank. Both of them were born in Kentucky and had a natural camaraderie because of it. It was while filming Donnie Brasco in 1996 that Johnny Depp got a call from Hunter asking him to play Duke. But nothing was signed at this point, just the spirit of the thing had been agreed upon between fellow boys from down south. It was during this period in the early mid-90s, while working with Rhino on pre-production, that the team first had confluence with British director Alex Cox, known for cult movies like Repo Man starring Emilio Estevez and Sid and Nancy with a young Gary Oldman. But she said the meeting went terribly and things continued rolling along elsewhere.
Fear and Loathing is hard. It scared a lot of people, and I think we just couldn't get them to deal with what it took to commit to it. And Rhino was facing deadlines with their option agreements. So they just went ahead and said, let's do it with Alex Cox. And they hired Alex Cox without me saying okay.
Panic. It crept up my spine like first rising vibes of an acid frenzy.
So now the team are at an impasse. Rhino Films has to begin filming in 4 months, or their option will run out. They want Alex Cox because they believe he can get in and make the movie fast. But the producer and godmother of the piece isn't a fan of the director and wants someone else. You can read what she really thinks in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, The Untold Story. There was no cast under contract, just a producer and director who really didn't get along, all with a deadline looming. Typical Gonzo. It's now September of '96, and Hunter gets invited back to Louisville to receive the keys to the city, with both Johnny and Layla in attendance. Hunter and Johnny wanted to let Rhino's option lapse so that they could regroup and make it on their own terms, but Layla knew that Rhino was so desperate for it not to lapse that they might just make a low-budget piece of shit and ruin the whole cause. She said,
They'll turn the cameras on January 5th, no matter what, starring whoever. The only way to win this is from within.
This is when Steve Nemeth from Rhino tells her he's going to give Johnny Depp 24 hours to make a decision, pushing him into a corner. Finally, Depp agreed. Now, Alex Cox went off to quickly write his own version of the screenplay, and over the Christmas break, he contacted Hunter. He wanted to come and pitch him at Owl Farm, which he and his co-writer did. Hunter actually had this exchange recorded on videotape. A videotape Layla said should be titled,
How Not to Approach a Writer When You Want to Adapt Their Book.
This footage was later released in the 2003 documentary Breakfast with Hunter, where things seemed to be going okay until Hunter arrived at an animated sequence for the Wave speech, the most honored passage of the book. It would be of a little cartoon Hunter being washed back to LA on a wave of bones. So now Alex Cox slinks off to do a rewrite that's due in a week. But during that week, he contacted Steve Nemeth and said, listen, I'm going to do this rewrite, but either I go or Layla goes.
The writer is saying that you told him to make fucking cartoons out of it and put Ralph's goddamn drawings in the cartoon characters. If you want war, here we go, baby. There's gonna be a nasty fucking war.
He then turned in the rewrite and essentially changed nothing, drawing a line in the sand with him on the wrong side, leaving the project soon after when it was obvious he'd lost the war. Layla said later,
He came back trying to sue, saying Rhino fired him. They didn't. He fired himself.
You turning on me at the end, I must say I don't like that at all.
Well, he didn't by calling you.
Yeah,
I called to find out.
But when Alex said, oh, you should talk to Layla, you were like,
What should I have said? No, I know Layla for many years, and she would never say that. Fuck. Yeah.
Yes, that would have been nice. I would have liked that. I would have accepted that show of confidence.
You got him on the movie. So after that,
No,
that's what I was going on.
pressured into it.
Cox ended up getting paid for work on the script and a writer's credit for it, which I'll mention later. But the team were back to searching for a director. Enter Terry Gilliam. Terry Gilliam first came to prominence as the American cast member of Monty Python after leaving the US and renouncing his citizenship in disgust in the late 60s, largely because of the same things Hunter would write about in Fear and Loathing. After creating the animation for Monty Python's Flying Circus, Gilliam began his larger career by co-directing 1975's cult classic Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Over the next 20 years, he directed 6 feature films, including Time Bandits, Brazil, and 12 Monkeys, which came out in 1995 and was a box office success. He was riding the wave and plotting his next feature when he was contacted by his friend Ralph Steadman, who wanted to champion him for Fear and Loathing. At the time, though, Gilliam was actively trying to get a film called The Defective Detective made. You've never heard of it because that project fell apart with the financing, a habit Gilliam is notorious for, as I'm sure some of you know. After Gilliam licked his wounds, they talked him into meeting with everyone, including Hunter, which sealed the deal. They'd raised $7 million at that point, but Gilliam knew it wouldn't be enough and said they'd have to double it at least. Eventually, they collected $18 million for the budget, with half coming from Rhino Films' foreign sales and half from Universal Studios, who did a negative pickup for the domestic release and distribution. That means Universal would pay for the production costs, plus whatever back end each agent is able to negotiate for their clients, and then the studio distributes it and makes their profit. But even so, Gilliam didn't want Universal to have anything to do with the project. After all, he had dibs on Final Cut in his contract, and he remembered saying something like,
"This is a cheap film, it'll make its money back. Now, fuck off and leave us alone."
Another part of his contract was a script rewrite, and after enlisting the help of British screenwriter Tony Grisoni, Gilliam set about carving up Thompson's source material. He had a problem that needed to be solved. How do you convey to an audience that these are not just assholes running around Vegas hassling the locals without derailing the book's opening momentum by spending time giving context to and explaining everything that I've just been explaining to you? That these are professionals, one a lawyer and the other a journalist on assignment. But Gilliam wanted to come out of the gate sprinting.
The versions that had been written had obviously worked very hard at trying to solve the inherent problems of turning the book into a film, which we decided to ignore.
Cribbing straight from the page, they cut and pasted words, sentences, and passages into a twisted morality play in only 8 days. They took a break, read it afresh separately, and then spent 2 more days fixing it.
In a sense, it's a very arrogant piece. It just says, this is what it is. If you don't like it, if you don't get it, that's your problem.
Buy the ticket, take the ride. To everyone's surprise, Terry soon confessed that he had never taken psychedelics before. And there was some concern that it could hobble his craft in this particular instance.
What we realized quickly was Terry is a very different kind of guy and doesn't need to take acid. And hopefully will never take acid, because God knows what would happen then.
Come on, hurry up.
In order to effectively convey the various altered states, the filmmakers prepared a list of phases which detailed the cinematic qualities of each drug. Gilliam created these with first-timer Hollywood cinematographer Nicola Pecorini, a one-eyed cameraman Terry brought on based on his audition tape and commitment to the project. Gilliam and Pecorini opted to shoot the picture in widescreen Super 35. Pecorini said, "We were sometimes literally shooting with a 12mm lens 3 inches away from Johnny Depp's nose." However, he did bend his rule to achieve a shot that creeps way into one of Johnny's eyeballs, where the bats are all swooping and screeching and diving around the car. It's a genre-defining shot in my opinion, and one of my favorites of all time. Despite the show's hell-bent 56-day schedule and difficult shooting conditions, Pecorini describes his Fear and Loathing experience as a very important turning point in his career, and he has worked with Terry Gilliam ever since. Like everything else involved, post-production was fraught with difficulties because they couldn't afford to edit it digitally and had to do it old school, cutting and taping the film by hand, doing only the special effects in a computer, such as the hallucinations, recreating the Las Vegas Strip in 1971, and the light bulb hit transition from the hotel room back to the 60s. Speaking of, that's Layla dressed up as Grace Slick in the background. It was during post-production that Alex Cox sued for a writing credit, and the case went into arbitration with the Writers Guild based on their very specific criteria of who wrote what and where it came from. all of which took time to navigate. So Terry was pulling his hair out trying to get the movie finished, while also spending more time explaining how he wrote it than he did actually writing it, which is even more ironic because all of these scripts were pulling from the same source material.
It was an embarrassing situation. I think the Writers Guild realized they'd made a big mistake, but in the end, we got first position.
Now, having finished the movie and feeling they had done something quite extraordinary, the film was chosen to be debuted at Cannes, a first for Gilliam. The festival runner was convinced that it would be in competition for the Palme d'Or. The press go in for a dawn screening while Gilliam and Depp prepare for a long day of press interviews and meet and greets. It'll be hard, but fun and worth it in the end, right? That's when their French PR man appeared, ashen-faced, like he had just been to a funeral.
And I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "They hated it. They despised it. They walked out. It was a disaster, Terry."
And with that, they had to spend the rest of the day trying to be upbeat about the movie while spending hours and hours discussing it with people who hate it.
What the sad thing about Cannes is that it really is like a pack of wild dogs. Once they turn on you, there's no going back.
Luckily, he did discover that after a few days, people started coming out of the woodwork saying they actually liked it, but they kept their heads low.
The decision to flee came suddenly. Or maybe not. Maybe I'd planned it all along, subconsciously waiting for the right moment.
Still, it hinted at the future, even though the knock-on effect reverberated for the next few months after the screening. Universal had no idea how to market the movie, and after Cannes, they lowered their budgets for promoting it.
So all we can do is keep running around doing interviews. Hopefully somebody will write something about it, but you're doomed at that moment.
It was released in US cinemas 1 week after the Cannes premiere and went on to gross $10.6 million, well below its budget of $18.5. I didn't know any of this when I rented the VHS tape the following November. I had unexpectedly obtained 2 hits of acid earlier in the day and wanted something strange to watch, so I asked my friend at Blockbuster and he recommended Fear and Loathing. I had seen several Gilliam movies, and I knew both Johnny Depp and Benicio del Toro, but I hadn't read the book, so I was not beholden to the author or the piece. It was all new to me. I watched it twice that night. 2 times, because I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. Not because I was wasted, I was in awe. With hindsight, that was the most influential night of my life until that point. And over the next few years, I amassed Hunter's entire collected works. In typical fashion, Hunter called Benicio after he watched the film and told him his career was over, which had some truth to it. Even though he had been stone sober the whole time, there was a period afterwards where he couldn't get a gig because of the stigma associated with the part, the movie, the drugs. So is it a drug movie or not? Layla says it's a political movie. Gilliam says,
"There are no answers, only questions."
When Hunter committed suicide 20 years ago, I wasn't surprised. I knew he was in poor health and he had been saying he would do it himself for decades. He lived by the word and the gun, and he wanted to end it that way too. The man who never met a deadline, who kept the hours of a vampire bat, had inadvertently created a folk mythology in Raoul and Dr. Gonzo, using them as a portal to a counterculture understanding of the capitalist nightmare they saw taking over in America. That's what the book is about. 2 people who see the pain of the American dream getting sucked into hell by the powers that be. The drugs were armor and ammunition for going into the world and trying to expose it, and the pain of being in it and knowing the truth. It doesn't preach rebellion so much as it explains the rebellion of the time.
10 years before John F. Kennedy had been killed, Martin Luther gets killed, then Bobby Kennedy gets killed, and then Nixon comes in and says, "I got a secret how to finish the war." He gets elected, he escalates the war, and then he gets reelected, Nixon. And that's when these guys go like, what's left? Fear and loathing. That's the way I looked at it.
Why don't, Uye and Aye, Oge and Etge the Ufstay out of the Umptre.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Get years worth of these planned out. Also go back and check out the other essays I've done, like on Color Me Kubrick and Southland Tales. Oh, and check out the old Back to the Podcast episodes with Lawler and I too. Some of those are starting to get watched now that we're growing. We've got a year's worth of great content just sitting there waiting for you. All right, everyone be good, and I'll catch you on the next one. I'm thinking Dogma if I can find enough behind the scenes material to flesh it out. I don't know, what do you think?